Thank you for coming out and supporting your local independent bookstore. I'm Sally, and I'm a bookseller here, and I'm very happy to have here two authors, both of whom I've known since the early 1990s, it turns out. And so I'm really happy to see their book, and such a lovely book it is. But I'm not going to introduce them. Tonight here to introduce them is Linda Pearsall, and she is the director of the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program in the Department of Environment and Natural Resources in the state of North Carolina.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us this evening. It's nice to see some familiar faces, folks I haven't seen for a while, and a few folks I've seen recently. The North Carolina Natural Heritage Program is proud to see this book come out, even though it's not a department publication, but it is founded upon one of the first natural community classifications done in the United States. And Mike and a gentleman named Alan Weekly created this classification. And it's been a key component of conservation in North Carolina since it was written in the I think the third approximation, the one that we use now, was created in the early 90s. About 10 years after it was created, David Blevins came to my office and said, "Hi, I'm new back to North Carolina, and I was involved in conservation in British Columbia, and I think it's really important to reach out to a new audience and explain about the importance of the natural communities that have been described in documents like the third approximation that Mike wrote." And David then showed me photographs of work he'd done in British Columbia that had helped save one of the important natural areas there. I didn't know quite how to answer David, but I told him to talk to Mike. And David and Mike came together and produced this beautiful book. And the hope is that this book will reach a new audience, that it will help support conservation of some of the incredible places we have in North Carolina. And I hope that you will join me in celebrating this book and the work that David and Mike have done. Thank you for joining us this evening.
So I'm going to talk for a little bit first, and then David will talk a little bit, and then we'll answer questions. We'll both answer questions after that. And I'm not exactly going to read from the book, but say a little bit that will give you some flavor of what it's like, and a little bit about the background behind it, or how it came to be, what led up to it. Okay, there we go. There we're switching. Okay, so picture yourself walking through the woods, someplace close to here, maybe Umstead State Park, or maybe along the Eno River, if you're a fan of the Triangle Land Conservancy, maybe Swift Creek Bluffs down in Cary. You've been out enjoying this beautiful brief season that most people just call spring, but I like to call the pastel season, the season when you have the soft colors of the young oak leaves and oak flowers. Some people insist on focusing on the yellow rain of pollen instead, but it's really one of the most beautiful seasons of the year. So you may be walking along a creek looking up at a forested bluff, or you may have come down from the rolling hills above where you're looking down at that last little bit of slope above the creek, and you see that the forest is different here from where you were walking earlier. There are beech trees like these with their smooth gray bark and often the vestiges of last autumn's leaves still clinging to them, maybe red oaks and tulip poplars. And underneath there are smaller trees, dogwoods, hop hornbeam, maybe even umbrella magnolias like you see here in this picture on the upper right with their big leaves just coming out. On the ground there are lots of herbaceous plants, Christmas ferns with their dark green fronds like you see here. There are young fiddleheads coming up this time of year, trout lilies with their speckled leaves, and if you'd been a little earlier, they're wonderful yellow flowers, maybe bloodroot, and maybe a dozen others, maybe even more different kinds. The air is full of that damp, musty smell of growth and decomposition that comes with the warming weather, and the air is full of the sound of singing birds as well. There's squirrels rustling in the treetops. And if you look a little harder, there may be other animals that you could find signs of, like a raccoon sleeping up in the branches, or a little hole where a vole or a shrew lives. If you could look even closer, you'd see even more living things. Little tiny snails, maybe, white threads of fungi under the leaves, quietly decomposing the dead leaves, tiny insects and mites in the soil, microscopic nematode worms, bacteria, all of them living their lives, interacting with each other, doing what they do. And you might have noticed that when you came into this place, if it was a sunny day, the air got a little cooler when you came down this slope, a little damper, because this slope faces north, or maybe because there's a slope opposite of this that's sheltering it. If you went to another cool lower slope like this, maybe another one of the places I mentioned at the beginning, you'd find a pretty similar collection of living things there. Not exactly, but enough that you could agree it's the same kind of collection. They're just what tends to live in this kind of environment if people haven't messed with it too much. So this is what we call a natural community. We call it a community because there's lots of different members living together and interacting there. And natural because they're here, not because people planted them, not exactly by accident, but because of the forces and processes of nature. Also natural because, as best we can tell, if modern human technology had never come to this place, something very much like them would still be in this place and other places like it. And if you were a Native American in 1400 wandering away from your village's field for a while, you probably would have seen about the same kind of thing. They would have been a bit different, certainly much larger trees, some of them up to 4 and 5 feet rather than in diameter rather than the 2 or 3 feet you're lucky to see now, though there'd also be some smaller trees still. Maybe there'd be the claw marks of a black bear on the trees, something that doesn't live around here anymore. Maybe the bones of a deer killed by a mountain lion. Maybe the call of a passenger pigeon in the air. But similar enough that you'd still recognize it as the same kind of thing. Now you may have seen a couple of other kinds of natural communities on this walk too. Maybe a forest of oaks and hickories like the one pictured here, the sort of thing that covers our upland hills. Or maybe the distinctive forest of the creek bottoms along the water. You probably saw some things that aren't natural communities as well. The forests of loblolly pine that we have that are so common around here, but that occur only in places where there used to be a farm field or a clear cut. Now those are to some degree a product of natural forces too, responding to the disturbance in the past, but they aren't what you would find without drastic human alteration in the past. Now, picture yourself in a place a bit farther from here, down in the flatlands to the east, toward Wilmington or Beaufort. Very different kind of woods. Maybe only one kind of tree, longleaf pine. Arguably the most graceful tree we have, with its clear, straight trunks and long sprays of long needles. The breeze here always seems to make a quiet sigh in those long pine needles, and on a warm day, that sweet resinous pine smell is a pleasant backdrop. The trees are more widely spaced here, so even though it's wooded, it feels open and airy, and it's pretty sunny almost all year. Almost no smaller trees beneath the canopy trees, but dense grass covering the ground. Sort of like a lawn, but the grass is in clumps rather than being a smooth sod. And it includes grasses you won't see anywhere else, like the toothache grass, which they call it that because if you chew on it, it numbs your mouth. And in between the grass, broadleaf herbs. This time of year, you might see showy orchid flowers like the common grass pink or the rosebud orchid. Maybe little white flowers of sundews. Maybe even this marvel of a plant, the Venus flytrap, which only lives in pretty much this kind of natural community. And if you dig down between the grass clumps, you'll just find more and more different kinds of small plants. And finally, beneath them all, bare soil with charcoal on it. And you might notice there's charcoal on the trees, too. Fires have burned across this place. This, too, is the work of nature, though it now needs a little help from people, though that only because people have blocked the spread of the natural fires in the first place. Now, the animals here are almost completely different from the moist forest we started out picturing. There might still be bears wandering through here, but you might have the squeaky call of a nuthatch. If you're lucky, maybe even the short clipped note of the red cockaded woodpecker, one of our rarest birds, and one of the ones with one of the most unusual lifestyles. Even the butterflies and grasshoppers here are mostly different, and many of them only occur in this kind of place. This is a wet pine savanna, another kind of natural community. Once again, if you went to a similar environment, saturated often but never really flooded, the right kind of soil, the chance for fires to burn through, you'd find a similar community, but one that you could recognize as being the same kind of thing if people hadn't messed with it too much. And if you walk to the edge, you'd probably find it giving way to the same other kinds of natural communities, probably that dense shrub wall of the communities we call precosins. So this is what Wild North Carolina is about. Natural communities you know and maybe didn't know you knew, and ones you may never have thought of. How they look at times you may not have seen them. Things about them you might not know. They're all part of that legacy everyone who comes to North Carolina shares. Those wonderful places that are left that show you what once was and what can still be when we take care of places. Each can show you something special about how the world really is. And each has its role to play in the ecosystems we depend on, and so they work for you whether you know it or not. And this book is our offering to share with you their beauty and fascination. So a little bit of background on how the book came to be. Many of my colleagues have a story of how they grew up in the woods or watching birds. Many of them were interested in nature from as early as they can remember. I wish I could say the same thing. It took me a bit longer. I spent most of my childhood with my nose in books, and many of them science fiction books. But I had parents who planted the seeds, who appreciated nature and took me camping and hiking around this great country. And my first encounter with a high mountain in Colorado when I was a teenager was a real awakening to the wonders of wild places. The first chance to be on top of the world in a scene where the works of man were scarcely visible. Not many opportunities like that in Illinois where I grew up. That mountain was Gray's Peak, which it turns out is named for a botanist, which was perhaps prophetic. So I came to North Carolina to graduate school. Then I learned the quantitative techniques of community ecology, plot sampling, multivariate analysis, ordination, and correlation. And I was blessed to be hired at the Natural Heritage Program to write a new natural community classification for the state. And there I learned what may be the more difficult techniques of applied community ecology, integrating quantitative data, which there never is quite enough of, with the broader experience available in qualitative reports and personal experience, and learning how to find the underlying patterns, how to figure out what's natural, how to deduce why things are the way they are. I learned from some wonderful people there who shared their knowledge and their way of looking at the world and their love of it. Some of you are familiar with the technical classification books that came out of that work, the successive approximations of understanding of natural communities, which I'm still approximating on. Yeah. So I spent some 25 years at the Natural Heritage Program before the words of this book started making it to paper or electrons. My work took me to the most wonderful natural spots in the state, and when I wasn't working, I spent days and weeks and more weeks hiking and getting to know the wild places, hiking and paddling, bushwhacking and wading, poking around, even periodic recreational Pocosin crashing. Nothing lots of people don't do, except maybe the recreational Pocosin crashing. But a great chance to appreciate these places on a lot of different levels. And also, shortly after I started working at the Natural Heritage Program, a friend of mine gave me his old copy of the Natural Gardens of North Carolina. He was an engineer, not a naturalist, but he knew something about the natural communities of North Carolina because of that book, and he cared about them because he knew something about them. Other people I might not have expected also mentioned that book to me, though it had been out of print for a long time then, and it is now back in print, and I think you can buy it here. B.W. Wells, who wrote that book, was a pioneer of the science of ecology in North Carolina. That book carried some of his scientific understanding without requiring the reader to work hard to read it. And it also shared the appeal of the natural communities through pictures and word pictures, and just being upfront about how much he liked them. So sometime 10 years ago, maybe 15, I started thinking there would be value in another contribution like that, in a book that would share appreciation and aesthetic description and pictures, along with interesting and fun bits of science. We've learned a lot about ecology since the pioneer days of B.W. Wells, and he just picked and chose certain kinds of communities to talk about. Having had the job of classifying them all, I think there's additional value in appreciating the full spectrum of them. So that idea incubated for a pretty long time. I have a pen pal out in Arizona who kept asking me when I was going to write that book, but I kept focusing on the more technical work instead. But I did start thinking about it, noticing things that would be nice to share and thinking about ways to describe them. And a few years ago I met David. And he liked North Carolina's natural community so much he was devoting a big piece of his photography career to photographing all the different kinds of them. And a little later here he was talking about the idea of a book, and it was pretty much the same idea. So he'd been working on this idea for years too. So we were very fortunate to get to join our dreams together and collaborate on it. So I started writing, wrote from my experience and the ideas I'd accumulated over the years. Even many turns of phrase that I used had been on the shelf for a long time. But it took a painful process of honing and pruning, figuring out how to say things, taking out words and complexities that might put people off. And I got some great additional ideas from David and from friends and colleagues along the way, and some wonderful help from the folks at UNC Press. So here it is done, and I hope you all like it.
I was struck. I appreciate this presentation and the book, and was really struck by the quote from Aldo Leopold about basically if you know what you're seeing, it hurts to see the damage. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious if you all could talk a little bit. If you were to step, or if we were to step 100 years into the future with things like climate change driving changes in communities, I'm interested to hear both. What are some of the communities that would be lost from here? And if you look at the best possible trend lines of things that are being restored now that we don't have good examples of now, but we might, what are some of the best communities we can hope to see that you weren't able to include in here because they're not really pure examples?
You want to take that one?
That's a pretty involved question, really. Next book maybe so. No, we don't really know for sure what the climate change will do to us. We have a pretty good idea on some trends that if things get hotter, the things that like cool places will not do well. Some of them may move out completely. One of the biggest problems is the things on tops of the mountains where that are there because it's cool, and if it warms up, they have to move higher up to keep in the same temperature range, and eventually they run out of mountain. There's actually some evidence that happened to some degree about 6,000 years ago when the climate was warmer than now. There are some mountains that are high enough that you could have spruce fir forest on the top of them based on how far down spruce fir forest comes, but you don't have them. And they're all the ones that are a little bit shorter than the highest ones. And so it's a pretty good idea that those are places where, when the climate was a little warmer than now, they got pushed off the top of the mountains. So that could happen to more of our spruce fir forests. And so so there are things that we may lose that way. There are things on the coast with rising sea level that are going to get drowned. There are other things that are going to shift in ways that we maybe don't know so well. But all of these things it's sort of, I don't know, it's a balancing act of the cliche of the glass half full or the glass half empty. There are things we're going to lose. There are lots of things we've already lost. There are things we still have. There are things that if we hang on to them now, we'll have something in the future. If we keep a lot of the pool of species in the range of community types we have now, we have something, nature has something to build the future with. If we don't, then nature doesn't have much to build the future with. So even though we don't necessarily know what we're going to have, nature is pretty resourceful if you give it things to work with. So our job now is to hang on to the things we have so it has something to work with.
Mike, did you encounter any physical hazards or weight loss problems during the writing process?
During what? During the writing of the book?
During the writing process.
Well, and as I said, I wrote it from 10 or 15 years worth, or 25 years worth of experience, so I didn't actually make many special trips to get the material. I sat at my desk and gained weight while I wrote it.
So you had a weight problem as well.
Yes, the onset, yeah.
But I think one of the things that attracted me to Mike's voice for the text for this book was when you listen to him, you can tell he's been there. And there are plenty of experts in the state that can tell you about the ecology, but they don't connect it with being there and talking about what's sinking into the mud and the things that make it real. So that was one thing that I thought the book really needed, was that sort of, to give you that sense of actually being there.
It's poetic.
It's really important.
Do you have day jobs that support it?
oh yes. Well, I do. I work at the Natural Heritage Program still. Linda Pearsall is my boss, and I've spent my whole career there.
My question is about how many plots, vegetation plots, do you think you work with these days? How many in North Carolina?
Let's see. I think the Carolina Vegetation Survey database has maybe 4,000, but they're not all in North Carolina. Some of them are in South Carolina and a few other places. So I'm not completely sure, but I stand by what I said about quantitative data still isn't really enough. I've got to use the qualitative data that's out there as well to make sense of things. Even though we've got the biggest plot data set that's ever been assembled by far in this part of the world. The world is just really complicated. You need all the information you can get on it.
All right.
I want to thank everyone for coming. And we have the books up at the counter, and they are for sale. And Mike and David would for you. And thank you all for coming. And let's give them a hand.